My name is Sandra. Standing on the dock, surrounded by the laughter and music of the party, I watched as my father's face turned purple with rage. He was shouting, spittle flying, but I remained calm. The truth was on my side, and I knew it would prevail. It all started on a Tuesday at 4:11. I was 35, standing in a parking garage in Denver with my keys in hand. My phone rang, and it was my brother, Jake. He was 28, lying in a hospital bed in a neighboring county, his leg crushed in a construction accident. The surgeon needed $12,000 and a decision within 3 weeks, or his knee would fuse incorrectly, leaving him with a permanent limp. I hadn't spoken to my parents in 10 years. On the call, I could hear my mother in the background, her voice cold and dismissive. "Maybe a limp will teach him responsibility," she said. That was the moment I knew I had to do something. I'm a forensic accountant. My job is to find the discrepancies between the money and the stories people tell. So when Jake mentioned that my parents had just bought a new boat, a cold part of my brain kicked into gear. A boat costs a lot more than $12,000. I drove the 130 miles back to Pine Lake before dawn. It's a small town on the edge of a lake, where everyone knows everyone else's business. Jake looked smaller than I remembered, his leg in a brace and an .4 in his hand. He grabbed my fingers and held on tight. The surgeon, Dr. Thompson, was straightforward. The knee needed surgery, and insurance would cover most of it, but there was a $12,000 gap. Jake had called our parents, but they'd said they couldn't help because they'd just bought a boat. I went to see my parents. Their house sat on a hill overlooking the lake. The first thing I saw was the boat, a huge, shiny vessel named New Horizons. My father came out onto the porch. He'd gone soft and complacent over the years. My mother appeared behind him, her face expressionless. I told them straight out that Jake needed $12,000 for surgery. My father started talking about cash flow and how everything was tied up. My mother folded her arms and said, "He should have been more careful." I didn't argue. I knew it was pointless. I drove to a diner and ordered coffee, but I couldn't drink it. I kept thinking about my grandmother, who had passed away 11 years ago. She'd always been kind to me and Jake. She used to say, "Don't you worry, I've got something set aside for you too." That night, I went to Jake's apartment. It was a small place above a bookstore. We talked about the past 10 years. He told me how our parents had always been stingy when he needed help, but they'd managed to afford a boat, an RV, and a new kitchen. I asked him if he remembered what Grandma had said about the money. He nodded. "Yeah, she said there was something for us." I thought it was just a little savings that got used up at the funeral. The next morning, I started digging. I went to the county recorder's office. The clerk was friendly and helped me pull my grandmother's probate file. There, I found a reference to a trust, the Grace Miller Family Trust, established for the medical and educational needs of her grandchildren, Jake and me. It was funded with $50,000 from the sale of my grandfather's land. The trust named 2 trustees, my father, Henry, and a man named Frank Harris. Frank ran an insurance agency in town, and he and my father had been friends for 25 years. I had a feeling that Frank was just a rubber stamp for my father. I made a mistake and went to see my sister, Lily. She was 38, married with 2 kids, and she'd stayed close to our parents. When she saw me, her face closed up. I told her about Jake's surgery and the boat. She just said, "Mom and Dad don't have the money. You don't understand their expenses." I asked her if their expenses included a $45,000 boat. Her jaw tightened. "That's their business." And then she said the same thing I'd heard from our parents: Jake needs to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. Maybe a limp will teach him responsibility. I asked her if she knew about the trust. Her hands froze on the grocery bag she was carrying. For a moment, something flashed across her face, but then she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I knew she was lying. The silence around the trust was a family policy. I went to see the lawyer who'd drafted the trust, Mr. Thompson. He remembered my grandmother fondly but got cautious when I asked for an accounting of the trust. He said my father and Frank administered it, and as a beneficiary, I had the right to an accounting, but I'd have to request it formally. And since my father was a long-time client, he couldn't help me. While I was building my case, Dr. Thompson called. The window for the best outcome for Jake's knee was closing fast. It was down to 10 days. I didn't hesitate. I wired the $12,000 from my own savings to the hospital and told them to schedule the surgery as soon as possible. My mother found out I'd been looking into the trust. She called me and said, "Don't embarrass this family, Sandra." I asked her why she'd be embarrassed by me looking at a public document. She said, "That money was spent on things this family needed. You weren't here." I told her I'd leave it alone if she could show me one piece of paper proving the trust had been spent on me or Jake. She hung up. I started looking into Frank Harris. I found out that my father had sent him a lot of business over the years. Most of the Lake families insured their boats and homes through Frank because of my father's recommendation. A co-trustee is supposed to be a check on the other, but Frank was clearly in my father's pocket. The break in the case came from Jake's closet. He mentioned that Grandma's stuff was in a cedar box. I opened it, and inside was a manila envelope. It contained Grandma's own copy of the trust deed and a letter. In the letter, she wrote that she'd sold Grandpa's land so there would be money for our schooling and medical needs because she didn't trust my father with the money. She'd named Frank as a second trustee and prayed it would be enough. And then she wrote, "If anyone ever tells you there's no money for you, child, you show them this." I sat on the floor and read the letter to Jake. My voice cracked as I read the last line. Grandma had known all along what my father was capable of. With the help of a lawyer, Miss Carter, who practiced in a nearby town and had no connection to my father, I finally got the trust's bank records. I sat down at my motel desk and reconciled them line by line. The $50,000 had gone into the trust as the deed said. But starting about a year after Grandma's death, it began to leave. There were withdrawals of $10,000 when they redid the kitchen, $15,000 before the RV appeared, and the largest withdrawal of $20,000 just 12 weeks before the boat was bought. There was less than $5,000 left in the trust. My parents were throwing a party to christen the boat. They'd invited half the town. It was the perfect opportunity to expose the truth. I called Miss Carter and told her my plan. She said, "File the petition on Monday, but what you do at the party is up to you. Just make sure every word is backed by evidence." I prepared my case. I made copies of the trust deed, Grandma's letter, the bank statements, and a timeline of the withdrawals and the corresponding purchases. I rehearsed what I would say, making sure to keep my voice calm. The night before the party, my mother came to my motel. She tried to talk me out of it, first being soft, then shifting to grievance, and finally getting angry. She said, "Your brother brought this on himself. And you've always thought you were better than us." I asked her if they'd spent Grandma's trust on themselves. She said that money was ours to manage. I told her I'd see her at the party. The morning of the party, Frank Harris found me. He was sweating and nervous. He offered to make the trust whole quietly if I'd call off my plan and keep his name out of it. He admitted that my father had directed all the withdrawals and he'd just signed off on them. I refused his offer. I stopped by Jake's place before going to the dock. He asked me if it was worth it. I told him it wasn't about getting even. It was about honoring Grandma's wishes. He squeezed my hand and said, "Go read her letter." When I arrived at the dock, the party was in full swing. There were bunting, champagne, and a crowd of people. My father was holding court by the boat. When he saw me, his smile faded. I waited for him to start his speech. Then I stepped forward and said, "Excuse me." Heads turned. I introduced myself as Henry and Carol's younger daughter. I said, most of you knew my grandmother, Grace Miller. She left a trust for me and Jake, $50,000 for our medical and educational needs. I took out Grandma's letter and read it aloud. The doc went silent. Then I laid out the bank statements and the timeline on the table. I said, 3 weeks ago, Jake asked these two people for $12,000 to save his leg, and they said no because they'd just bought a boat. But look at these withdrawals. They spent Grandma's money on their own luxuries. My father exploded. He started shouting, calling me ungrateful and jealous. My mother joined in, shrieking that I was lying. But the crowd could see the evidence on the table. One by one, the guests stepped back from my parents. My father ran out of breath. I stepped closer and said, Grandma didn't leave you a boat, Dad. She left a chance for Jake to keep his leg and for us to get an education. You took that chance and wasted it. I told the guests that on Monday, my lawyer would file a petition for a full accounting and the return of the diverted funds. The court could order the money repaid and put a lien on the boat. Ms. Carter filed the petition as promised. Faced with the evidence, my father's lawyer advised him to settle. The court ordered the restitution of the diverted funds, and the boat was sold to pay back the trust. Frank Harris resigned as trustee, and his business never recovered. My parents kept their house, but they lost their standing in the community. Lily called me a week after the party, crying and saying she was sorry she hadn't stood with me. I told her I understood, but I couldn't trust her completely. Jake healed well. By winter, he was walking without a limp. He framed a copy of Grandma's letter and hung it in his apartment. It made us both braver. I went back to Denver and my quiet life. I didn't reconcile with my parents. Some doors are better left closed. But I know that Grandma's love and the truth will always be with me. If there's someone in your life who hides the truth and makes excuses, don't argue. Find the proof, just like I did.